Our business is emission reductions if we are to save the climate crisis, because emission reductions are the basis upon which the climate system gets distorted and we face the impacts that we are faced with. So that's point number one. The second one is that the climate landscape is so much hell-bent towards mitigation. By mitigation, we are talking about any actions that everybody does or each country does to reduce on their emission profiles. In contrast, countries like Uganda that have negligible emissions, which is around 0.01% of the global total, our emphasis should be adaptation. And again, you can clearly see why the role of the media is important. You know how policy works. If the media throws in a thing or two or three, and then we try to speak collectively together about raising the profile of adaptation, not just at national level, but even at global level, maybe at some point we'll get that balance to begin giving adaptation the profile that it requires, which is the basis of all least developed countries as a way of taking their development agenda forward. Therefore, in order to have this meaningful discussion, the role of media is very key and central. So I'm sure I don't have to belabor that anymore. You already see what your role is and what you can help as an individual, as an organization, but also as a collective, all of you in the room. Now, how many of us have interfaced with a kaleidoscope? Do you know a kaleidoscope? A kaleidoscope is simply beautiful images that intertwine together that may not show you one direct picture. So it's kind of, it changes color and shape. It changes its color and shape depending on who is holding it. Why I'm putting this is for you to understand that the way I understand climate change may be different from the way Onesimus understands it, and may be different from the way the last media person in the room understands it. Yeah? So the role of media is very, very clear. That for my mother, climate change may not make so much sense per se, but she's experiencing variabilities that she can explain in her own words and framing that may make you, the elite, understand that, look, okay, this is climate change. Next slide, please. So, to a farmer, because now I want to bring the different dichotomies. To a farmer, unlike you and me, they will understand it differently. To them, if there's too much rain or too little rain or none at all, that circumstantially may be defined as climate change by us who frame these things in classroom, right? Because too much rain or too little rain and or none at all comes with extremes. Correct? So if it's too much rain, what does it come with? Excellent. So let's be in this together. So if it's too much rain, it comes with floods. If it's too little rain, it comes with mild droughts. And if it's none at all, it brings that grave drought that a farmer may not be able to realize anything from their effort. And that's why they adapt like this. Now, that picture tells you so many things. Is this the best approach? Okay, two questions come there. One, where he's getting his source of water, and two, whether the technology that he's using is sufficient enough to allow meaningful production. So I want you to have those at the back of our mind. And yet this is the backbone. I mean, this is what maybe over 80% of our people are engaged in. So you can clearly see how people's livelihood is put at stake. right? To a business person or to an entrepreneur, it could be a bit different. To an entrepreneur, then it will be, how do you invest more resources, for example, to do dam building? Or how do you invest more resources to avoid the risks that may affect your business from being affected by the impacts that we are faced with? So clearly you can see that everyone and anybody else is affected in a different way, depending on what they are looking at. But the bottom line is, it is essentially affecting our individual livelihood and well-being. Just imagine if this man did not have a water well nearby, then it would be problematic. There are two things that he could do. Either to abandon this land and sell it, which is repeatedly happening, sell it and then come to the city center to look for any other means of livelihood, or resort to riding a bike long distances to look for where the water is, to come back and water his plants. But is that productive in its own self? Next. So given that general scenario, and I hope it opens up your thinking a little bit in terms of where we're going, there are three key documents that must be a basis of your reporting. Those are the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. So I'll go through these because they are the main important documents, and it's the basis of all our work and the basis of all of us continuing to engage in climate response. I'll go through these very slowly. But as I go through them, I pose questions. Like the professor said, his professors are normally a problem solvers. You pose questions to your students, and then you try to see how you can collectively find answers. So it's what I'm going to do. And in fact, it will even help you understand better if you have that inquisitive mind. So if you have the 1992 convention, the question you should ask me, for example, what's the purpose of this convention and what does it strive to achieve? Okay? So you will look it up, but the purpose of this convention and the ultimate objective of the convention and any other related legal instruments that we always come up with in the Conference of Parties or that we may adopt is to achieve, in accordance with the relevant provisions of the convention, because the convention has so many provisions, right from the actions to be undertaken on adaptation, mitigation, technology, and so on and so forth, to stabilize the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at the level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. I've picked it up verbatim, but I can try to explain. That stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous, anthropogenic is the word they use, but anthropogenic merely means that the activities that people do is what constitutes anthropogenic. So what that literally means is that we are the cause of this problem, and we are also the problem solvers. Okay? At the level that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. But it puts three key caveats. It says that such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient enough to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. That if you left your landscape where a forest was, if you left that landscape for 5 or 10 years, you'll find that regeneration takes place on its own, right? So that's at the back of the minds of the framers. So the second caveat is to ensure that food production is not threatened. And the third point is to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So the question to you is then, how can these work together? Yeah? Because in order to allow economic development to proceed, it has a direct implication on what you do and on the climate system that you are looking at. Onesimus again talked about extractive. So, and that's where the complicated dilemma is. That it's bound around two trajectories that have been moving hand in hand for a very long time. The trajectory of global GDP, how do I increase my GDP as a poor country as Uganda, and how do I maintain temperature rise? Now, to maintain that, you may not have to deal in extractives as Onesimus mentioned. But me, as a policy maker, or as someone who is hell-bent about improving individual livelihood and well-being, will be focused on how do you ensure that communities have sufficient energy sources, as an example, to make them take a leap from the peasantry society that we are having to maybe a middle income. I'm only using phrases that you know. Okay? So you can see how complicated it is. So that is bound around Article 2, and look it up. Okay? The other article that you should look up is the principles, because the principles kind of guide the references that we've made in the convention. And the very first principle is, there are so many, but I'll read one which makes reference to, again, what Onesimus mentioned around, I think I had something talking about intergenerational equity, and then talking about justice, right? So the very first principle is that parties, and by parties we mean countries, not political parties, that parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of the present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. To a lawyer, that's a very heavily loaded statement. To me, a plain guy, it means two things. That you are torn between living now and doing things that will allow you, because I see so many younger faces, because if life is continue on the same pace, I'll die before you. So the thing is here is, how do you allow that you present, that you protect the climate system for the benefit of us who are present now and the future generation, so that they also have agency and they also have some kind of benefits that we've enjoyed for the last so many years. The last point that you need to reference, that you have to have in mind as you do your reporting in terms of the principles, is that it adds and says accordingly, and that's also critically important, so that you draw the bifurcations that exist between developed and developing, and then who should act first, right? Because there's a historical responsibility attached to where this climate crisis is coming from. So it says, accordingly, the developed country parties should take the lead in combating climate change and adverse effects thereof. Is that clear? And does that clearly point to you where the responsibility lies? I hope it does. So that is the convention. The second is the Kyoto Protocol. which was the legally binding document that was aimed at pushing developed countries to be responsible for the emissions that they have caused that are causing the distortions in the climate system. And there are two broad objectives in that Kyoto Protocol. One, to ensure that developed country parties reduce emissions by 5% below their 1990 levels. And the second point is to ensure that they support developing countries. Because I've told you, it's not our responsibility, right? So they have the responsibility to support developing countries to undertake both adaptation and mitigation. Come to the third one, which is the Paris Agreement. That's the newest. Maybe at that time some of you were born. This is now 2015. The rest of the things, maybe most of you were not. But Paris Agreement is 2015. And I was privileged to be a part of that discussion. So in 2015, we endorsed a very ambitious agenda. An agenda to do with sustainable development on one part, but also an agenda to do with the runaway climate system. At the heart of the Paris Agreement is the mitigation targets. Keeping temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade while maintaining 1.5 on the table. And that's why you see this 1.5 here. Some people confuse it to be 15. So I wear this because we have aspirations to keep 1.5 alive. That the 2015 was, having endorsed that globally, we're looking at how do you keep temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade while maintaining 1.5 on the table. Those are the mitigation targets. And the concept of balancing emissions and sources to net zero towards the end of the century. But as we do balance emissions and sources to net zero, let's remember the GDP economic trajectory that I talked about, but also the climate balance. So the concept of balancing emissions and sources to net zero towards the end of the century, and also this idea to repeatedly report on our emissions after 5 years. But it has since changed until Glasgow in 2021, say that maybe 5 years is long enough. If we continue reporting after 5 years, we may not reach the ambition that we are aiming at, limiting temperature rise well below 2 degrees. So we should get countries to submit or report every year. So every year we do report about our emission profiles and how that contributes to the climate crisis or the solving it thereof. So again, the same questions I think keep lingering around everybody's mind. That whose responsibility is it to delink those two trajectories? And who is responsible to fulfill mitigation and adaptation? And whose rights should mitigation and adaptation uphold? I think what has been agreed initially, it was thinking that it's only nation states that have a stake in this, not even the media, not even civil society. But increasingly after 2015, it's been agreed that, you see, governments alone cannot and may never be able to address this climate system. So this notion of nation states, I think increasingly has been put on the side to say, look, this collective engagement of all civil society, private sector, and each one's contribution matters to contribute to this climate crisis. Next. I'll speak this one through very quickly. So this is a graph only re-emphasizing some of the things that I've said, that the climate crisis has a historical responsibility. A historical responsibility because it's bound around the Industrial Revolution, starting at that time. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, how it happened, and what it caused us to what we are now, is from 1900 to maybe about 2000 is when the observation around increasing emissions started. Now, from 2000 onwards, and with the policy frameworks that I've tried to explain, it clearly shows you that we have different emission scenarios, and if we go through those different emission scenarios, give us a different picture. That if actions are taken based on what countries reflect in their NDCs being the nationally determined contributions, maybe we'll try to limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade. But if nothing is done, then we're likely to end up with a 4-degree scenario or 5-degree scenario. But this was before the NDCs were crafted. Right now, if you look at the IPCC documents, IPCC being the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it will clearly show you that we are way below the ambition that was set in Paris. The carbon management plans that all countries have submitted lead us to a trajectory of about 3 degrees centigrade. I'll try to explain that in my next slide. Go to the next. So this is something I did on my own when I was doing my MSc a couple of years ago, 2016. I was asking myself the same questions that you should ask yourselves. We have 1900, 1990s, the policies and all the frameworks that have been listed. If you look at these 2 bars, we have the convention, first, which I talked about. We have the Kyoto Protocol. When it was ratified, I've not included the Paris Agreement. But if you see, ever since these frameworks were put in place, emissions still continue increasing. Why? So the question you should ask yourself, perhaps, does climate policy, is it meeting its objectives? Point number 1. But there are also 2 obvious points there. That perhaps the frameworks that we have come up with are only aiming at emission reductions, and not so much looking at production of these emissions. Maybe we may need to have a rethink in terms of only looking at the top end and see how then do we curb it from the production level. Now that may require another agreement altogether. Why? Because the UN, all these discussions that we have happen within the ambits of the UN. The UN is a consensus body, okay? Now, if you say we are going to curb emissions at production level, will the oil producing countries agree to that? Definitely not. And then it means you hit a deadlock, okay? So that, next slide, I'll give you these things so that you, so that's why from all that I've presented, the emission profiles that we have and where it's the historical background, where it's coming from, actually leads us to what we see or what we interface with on a daily. And this is not new. This is a picture that I took somewhere in Serere Soroti areas. Click again, there will be something that will appear. So as a media person, you need to understand risk in relation to climate change. For us, climate change is continuously about risks, right? Risks for people, risks for ecosystems, risks for freshwater resources, and risks for all the ecosystems that we occupy. And the more exposed and the more the hazards are, it increases one's vulnerability and it makes you move 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. This gentleman constructed his house in a flood-prone area. Now, these flood-prone areas, if we had something which is, maybe if we had these very good digital maps that show where flood-prone areas are, and there's a lot of awareness coming from you people, then we would never have people putting their investments within a flood-prone area, because water will always find its route. So eventually, when there's too much rain or too little rain or none at all, this guy is going to be affected. And indeed, he's going to become homeless. So you can see how that has a spiraling effect on the development aspirations that you are faced with. Next. So, as media people, I think we should be interested about, there's another slide on key issues. Interested about how these climate risks and hazards play about. Okay? What are these risks that there are? Because the vulnerability of me who comes from Mbale is different from the vulnerability of somebody who comes from Nakasongola, and is different from the vulnerability of somebody who comes from Buhweju. So we have unique vulnerabilities from where we come from. And once we work together to identify what those vulnerabilities are, then the next question that we ask, how are these vulnerabilities being taken in due consideration within your different local governments where you come from? That district local governments develop 5-year development plans. And in order for them to have action on these climate impacts, the starting point would be beginning to incorporate these climate risks within their development plans and how they are going to address them. And again, I'm sure, you see, to develop a 5-year district development plan, it's supposed to be a consultative process. I know maybe most of you may not follow, but I know the districts do hold these community engagements at district level. In order for this engagement to be meaningful, since you're being introduced to some of these things at the center, you'll add a lot of value if these are the questions that we interface with at the point when the district development plans are being developed. So that's the whole thing about integration and having these things in the plans. Next. So, remembering what I talked about the Paris Agreement and what it is it postulates in terms of the ambition it has on the mitigation targets, but also a lot of talks about adaptation planning, and lots of talk about finance. That's also another whole new discussion. We have outlined some of the targets that we want to achieve to address the emissions dilemma. So in the NDC, we've enlisted to say, look, I think one of the things that we need to do is to increase renewable energy generation from 972 megawatts as it was in 2013 to about 3,200 megawatts by 2030. So we are measured at global level based on those commitments that we made. And why do we want to do that? Because we know that affordable power and available power for both demand and supply makes a lot of sense in terms of our forestry cover. I'm coming in a minute. So when we go to forestry cover as a second target, we realize that forestry cover has been depleting at a very unsustainable level. And we are aiming at increasing forestry cover from about 14% to about 28% by 2030. We have those time frames because it's the time frames that we agreed to when we were framing the Paris Agreement. Maybe those time frames are going to change by 2030, but it's on this basis that we are that we submitted our NDCs, and it's what we are using as a benchmark to address these things. Wetlands coverage, increasing wetlands coverage from about 11% to about 18% by 2030. But for me, I think the general principle here, you'll see out of all these targets that we've enlisted, they are bound around nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions because the NDC doesn't compel you to do things that you cannot offer to address the climate crisis. The NDC requires you to subject yourself to something that you determine. That's what it's called nationally determined contribution. That your contribution to reducing emissions. And for us, we found a lot of leverage in advancing nature-based solutions, because we have the forests, we have the wetlands, and we have everything else that we need to have to contribute to that. And we have tried to measure within that the kind of emission reductions that will reduce, if indeed we will contribute to, if indeed we live to the targets that we have set.